One of the most important things to consider in terms of the influences on scientific research is just our own well-being and our own health. And science has had a huge impact on our health. If you go to this idea of medical surgical devices and just this idea of medicine in general, and the idea that prior to the 20th century, surgery was more than likely going to had just as much chance of killing you as it did of healing you. And hygiene was non-existent. The infamous story of Florence Nightingale being a nurse and sort of trying to introduce hygiene into battle hospitals sort of highlights a lot of the issues. Particularly surgeons, doctors at the time were quite arrogant and didn't figure that they were sort of the upper part of society, so they didn't need to clean themselves. And so a lot of the time people would die of infections afterwards. And modern surgery, which is in a almost sterile environment, you have modern innovations like keyhole surgery, which involves just using mostly things like arthroscopes, where a small incision is made and the technology goes in there and it performs the surgery under the doctor's guidance and basically reduces the amount of infection. And if we look at the history of this here, the history of surgery goes back several thousand years. There's been archaeological evidence of this technique called trepination, where, skulls have been discovered with holes, and they're deliberate holes, and they're holes that didn't cause death, because the bone of where the hole is has healed up. And so this goes back a very, very long time there. Probably the biggest theory of this is that this is probably people who suffered migraines, and the hole in the skull may have actually come about because people thought that the migraine was caused by an evil spirit. And sort of a cruel twist of fate, drilling the hole or cutting the hole in the skull more than likely relieved the symptoms of the migraine. And so even though people thought they were releasing evil spirits, it still had a positive effect on the person, who would have probably had this done under no anaesthetic and that as well. Of course, the birth of modern medicine is generally traced back to Hippocrates, and doctors in most parts of the world swear a Hippocratic oath, which is the idea of not causing harm, and the idea that doctors will try and heal people, but try and do it without actually harming people as well. Then you get to a few things here. One of the interesting things in Europe was that barbers used to be surgeons, and so you'd go and get your hair cut, but you might have got a sore tooth. I might get that pulled at the same time. I got shot the other day and I've got this bullet in my shoulder. The barber will take that out as well. Or you might have a gangrenous finger, and so we'll cut that off. And so interesting there that surgery obviously wasn't done in a sterile environment there. And of course, cutting off of limbs was actually quite common. It was done, you might have got an infected gunshot wound, and it was known that if that infection probably would kill you quite soon, so you cut it off under no anaesthetic as well. So probably maybe the use of ether or any other form of drug to essentially knock you out. But of course, these surgical procedures, where you go from there, where your surgery is done with a few people holding you, probably a bottle of whiskey or rum, and a doctor just trying to cut that thing off, holding it down in whatever means possible. So thankfully, modern surgical techniques are a lot better now. That's things you can see there. That's an example of keyhole surgery where the arthroscope is going in there. The doctors and nurses and everyone involved are looking at a camera And so things can be done. A lot of surgery can be done in that way as well, using tiny little scalpels, sutures, and things like that. So thankfully, in the modern world, this has improved a lot. And there's even the idea of using robotic devices as well as coming in commonly. Another thing that's really impacted, probably even more than surgery, is just the simple idea of pure water. Up until several hundred years ago, most people in villages would go to a well and get their water from there. Even things like cholera outbreaks in London came about because people were using interconnected wells, and if one got polluted, that would go to other ones there. Whereas in most modern countries, you take water, it goes through purification, which first of all takes out any particles, solid particles in there. It then goes through filter processes, gets disinfected, gets treated again, and by the time it's in your home, it's as pure as water can get. In third world countries, and this is something that's come about because of the thing we mentioned before in space exploration, in a third world country, where you don't have that benefit of a centralized processing center for your water, you can do something like a freshwater straw. Now, these can be sold in places where people might want to go bushwalking, and so they're a little worried about the water there. But this is a keen benefit that can help people in countries where they don't have fresh water. Also, again, vaccination programs. All you need to do to really try and understand the effect that vaccinations have had is simply look at data like this. In 1960, about 5,000 children died of preventable diseases. In the US, it was even worse. But things like vaccination programs have brought that down, and it's very noticeable in the United States. Huge drops. And you look at across the world, the number of children that die from measles, the number of children that died from whooping cough, diphtheria, cholera, all these diseases has dramatically decreased. And it's really hard to not fathom that vaccination has led to the child mortality rate going down to as close as zero as you can get. However, what has happened in places like the US is that, since 1950, in the US, almost 1 million children died in the 1950s a year, or at least 500,000 children died each year from measles. Then you get to the 1980s and 1990s. The number of deaths is incredibly small. However, you then get into the 2000s, and because of things like anti-vax things going on, the number of cases is rising. And, in 2019, that's 1,000 children that didn't necessarily have to die.